"Let's play a game," Jonathan Reeves said, not looking up from his watch, his voice smooth, controlled, the kind of voice that expected the world to lean in and listen. And across the table, standing still with a tray balanced lightly in her hand, Emily Carter didn't move, didn't smile wider, didn't react at all, just watched him the way someone watches a storm from behind glass, calm, distant, untouched, while the low murmur of the restaurant carried on around them, silverware clinking, soft, jazz drifting through the air, the glow of warm lights reflecting off polished wood and expensive suits. Jonathan finally lifting his gaze, expecting hesitation, expecting curiosity, expecting something he could measure, but finding none of it. Just a quiet steadiness that didn't bend, didn't shift, didn't ask permission, and it irritated him more than it should have, because men like Jonathan Reeves built empires on reactions, on leverage, on knowing exactly which button to press and when, and yet here she was, a waitress in a simple black uniform, standing like she had nothing to prove and nothing to lose. "I'm offering $100,000, he continued, louder now, just enough for the table behind him to hear, just enough to turn a few heads, to anyone who can make me change my mind tonight. A few soft laughs followed, the kind that come easy when money feels like entertainment, and Emily set a glass of water down in front of him with precise care, not too fast, not too slow, her movements quiet but exact, like she was following a rhythm no one else could hear. "Sir, would you like lemon with that?" she asked, her voice even, neither warm nor cold, just present, and Jonathan leaned back slightly, studying her now, because this wasn't how it usually went. There was always a flicker, a hesitation, a calculation, but she gave him none of it, no sign that his words had landed at all, and something about that felt like resistance, even though she hadn't said no, hadn't challenged him, hadn't done anything that could be called defiance, and still, the absence of reaction felt louder than any argument. "You're not curious?" he asked, tilting his head just slightly. Testing, probing, and she met his gaze for a brief second, not long enough to invite, not short enough to avoid, just enough to acknowledge. "Curiosity doesn't change orders," she replied, setting the menu back into place, her fingers steady, her posture relaxed but grounded, and the man across from him chuckled, assuming it was part of the performance, part of the role, but Jonathan didn't laugh, because something in her tone didn't feel like performance at all. It felt like truth, simple and unpolished, the kind that doesn't ask to be believed, and for a moment, just a moment, he felt something unfamiliar, not anger, not amusement, but a slight disruption in the pattern he knew so well, like a move in a game that didn't follow any known strategy, and he adjusted his cufflinks, a subtle motion, precise, controlled, grounding himself back into the structure he trusted. "Bring me the house special," he said finally, his voice returning to its usual calm authority, "and don't get it wrong." And Emily nodded once, not submissive, not defensive, just acknowledging the request, turning away with the same quiet composure she had arrived with, leaving behind a table that suddenly felt less certain than it had a minute ago, because for the first time that evening, Jonathan Reeves wasn't entirely sure who had just made the first move. The kitchen doors swung open and closed in a steady rhythm, releasing bursts of heat, the scent of butter and seared meat trailing into the dining room. But Emily Carter moved through it all untouched, her pace even, her focus sharp, as if the noise and pressure were happening somewhere just outside of her. She placed orders, checked plates, adjusted details no one else noticed, while at table 12, Jonathan Reeves watched without appearing to watch, his fingers resting lightly against the rim of his glass, his eyes following her timing, her precision, the way she never rushed yet never wasted a second, and it unsettled him more than any mistake would have, because mistakes could be corrected, controlled, but this quiet competence offered no entry point, no weakness to exploit. "She is new?" one of his associates asked casually, cutting into a perfectly cooked steak, and Jonathan did not answer right away, his gaze still fixed. "No," he said finally, though he had no confirmation. It felt like she had always been there, unnoticed, unbothered. Waiting, Emily returned with his plate, setting it down with the same exact alignment as the others, the knife placed just right, the edge facing inward, details so subtle most people would never see them. But Jonathan noticed, because he noticed everything. And yet, for the first time in a long time, noticing did not give him control. "You did not ask how I like it," he said, his tone mild, but edged. "Another test, small, deliberate." Emily met his words without meeting his challenge. "The house special is prepared one way, sir," she replied, her voice calm, consistently. A pause followed, not long, just enough for the meaning to settle, and something in that word lingered, consistently, as if it carried more weight than the sentence itself. Jonathan leaned back slightly, studying her again. "Consistency can be boring," he said, watching for a reaction, and Emily gave none. Only a slight tilt of her head, almost thoughtful. "Or it can be reliable," she said, and then she stepped away before the moment could stretch into something else, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. His associate laughed lightly, assuming it was clever banter, but Jonathan did not join in, because he could feel it now. The shift, small but undeniable, the edges of his control softening in a way he did not like. He picked up his fork, tasting the dish. Perfect. Exactly as expected. No deviation, no flaw, and somehow that irritated him more, because it left him with nothing to correct, nothing to improve, nothing to dominate. Across the room, Emily refilled another table's drinks, her movements just as measured, her expression unchanged, as if the exchange had meant nothing at all. And that was the part he could not accept, because everything meant something. In his world, every word, every glance, every silence, all of it part of a system he had mastered. And yet here was something outside that system, something that did not respond to pressure the way it should. He set his fork down slowly, the soft clink against the plate barely audible, but final. "Let us make it more interesting," he said, almost to himself, his voice low, controlled, but carrying intent. His associate looked up, curious, but Jonathan was no longer focused on the table, his attention already shifting forward, recalculating, adjusting, because if the first move had not worked, he would simply change the game. And somewhere across the room, without looking in his direction, Emily Carter reached for another glass, her hand steady, her breath even, as if she already knew that whatever came next would not be about the food at all. Jonathan Reeves did not look at the menu again. He did not need to. His attention had already shifted beyond the surface of the evening, beyond the food, beyond the polite structure of service. He rested his elbows lightly on the table, fingers steepled, eyes tracing the room until they landed on Emily Carter once more. She was at the far end now, speaking quietly to an older couple, her posture slightly lowered to meet their seated height, her voice invisible under the hum of conversation, but her presence unmistakable in its steadiness. And Jonathan exhaled slowly, not out of impatience, but calculation, because this was no longer about curiosity. This was about control. "Emily," he called, not loudly, but with precision, the kind of call that expected immediate acknowledgement. And she turned, not abruptly, not rushed, just a smooth shift of attention, her steps measured as she approached. "Yes, sir," she said, stopping at the correct distance, not too close, not distant, just enough to maintain professionalism without surrendering space. And Jonathan gave a slight smile, the kind that usually preceded a shift in tone. "I have changed my mind," he said, his voice calm, deliberate. "I would like something different." And she nodded once. "Of course, what would you prefer?" she asked, her pen already poised. But Jonathan did not answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back, letting the silence stretch just enough to be noticed, just enough to create pressure. "That depends," he said, watching her closely. "Convince me." A small pause followed, the table behind them quieting slightly, as if the air itself was listening. And Emily did not write anything down, did not rush to fill the space. She simply stood there, her expression unchanged, her breathing even, and that stillness made the moment sharper, because it refused to bend to his pace. "You are offering $100,000 tonight," she said finally, her voice steady, not questioning, not impressed, just stating a fact. "I am offering you a choice." Jonathan replied, his eyes narrowing just slightly. "Convince me to order something else, something I did not intend, and it is yours." He expected hesitation, a flicker of interest, maybe even ambition, but Emily only glanced briefly at the table, at the untouched plate, the arrangement, the symmetry, and then back at him. "Sir, you already made a choice," she said, her tone quiet but clear. And Jonathan let out a soft breath that almost resembled a laugh. "People change their minds all the time," he said, leaning forward now, bringing the pressure closer. "That is the point." And Emily held his gaze for a moment longer this time. Not challenging, not yielding, just present. "Yes," she said, "when they want to." The words settled gently, but they carried weight, and something in Jonathan's expression shifted, subtle, almost invisible, but real, because this was not resistance in the way he understood it. It was not opposition, it was absence, the absence of need, the absence of participation, and that made his offer meaningless in a way he could not immediately correct. He tapped his fingers once against the table, a small, controlled movement, recalibrating. "Then let us raise the stakes," he said, his voice lowering, sharper now. "I will double it." A murmur passed through the nearby tables, barely audible but present. $200,000, he continued, "for one sentence that changes my decision." And this time, the room did react, subtle glances, quiet attention, the gravity of the number settling into the space. But Emily did not move, did not lean in, did not even look surprised. She simply placed her pen back into her pocket, a small, deliberate action, and met his eyes again, calm as before. "Sir," she said, her voice softer now, but somehow more final, "some decisions are not for sale." And she stepped back, just slightly, not retreating, not dismissing, just resetting the distance. And for the first time that evening, Jonathan Reeves did not have an immediate response, because the game he was building required participation, and she was quietly refusing to play. The silence did not break, it settled, heavier now, stretching across the table like something tangible, something neither of them rushed to move. Jonathan Reeves leaned back slowly, his fingers resting against the edge of the table as if grounding himself in something familiar, something predictable. But the pattern he relied on was no longer responding the way it should. The numbers, the pressure, the escalation, none of it had landed, and across from him, Emily Carter had already shifted her attention, not away from him completely, but away from the moment he was trying to build, as if it had never fully existed for her in the first place. She turned slightly, adjusting a nearby table setting that did not need adjusting, a subtle act that carried a quiet message. The interaction was complete, and that, more than anything, unsettled him, because endings were supposed to be his decision, not hers. "Emily," he said again, this time without the performative edge, but with something closer to insistence, and she returned her focus to him, just as steady, just as composed. "Yes, sir," she replied, and he studied her for a longer moment now, not searching for weakness, but trying to understand the absence of it. "Do you always refuse opportunity?" he asked, his voice lower, more direct, and Emily did not answer immediately, not out of hesitation, but because she did not rush to fill space that did not need filling. "I choose what aligns," she said finally, her tone even, and Jonathan let out a small breath through his nose, almost a quiet acknowledgement, because that was not the answer of someone avoiding the question. It was the answer of someone who had already decided long before he asked. He glanced down at the table, at the untouched edges of the meal. The symmetry still intact, the control still present in the details, but slipping in the larger picture. And for the first time that evening, he reached for his glass without looking at her, taking a slow sip as if buying himself time, recalibrating not the situation, but himself. "Then tell me this," he said, placing the glass down with careful precision. "What would make you change your mind?" It was not a challenge now, not entirely, but something quieter, something closer to curiosity, and Emily watched him for a brief moment, not analyzing, not judging, just seeing. "It would not be a number," she said, and the simplicity of it landed deeper than any argument, because it removed the foundation he had built his question on. Jonathan nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a rule he had never considered before, and the room around them continued to move. Waiters passing, conversations resuming, the soft hum of normalcy returning. But at that table, something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Emily reached for the check presenter, placing it gently beside his hand, the motion quiet, final without being abrupt. "Take your time," she said, her voice unchanged, and she stepped back again, not retreating, not escaping, just allowing space where it was needed. And Jonathan looked at the check, then at her, then back at the table, and for the first time that evening, he did not feel the need to speak immediately, because the game he had started no longer had rules he could control, and the only move left was one he had never practiced before, doing nothing at all. Jonathan Reeves kept his hand resting near the check presenter, but he did not open it. Not yet, his eyes drifting instead toward the reflection of himself in the polished surface of the table, faint, distorted, unfamiliar in a way he could not immediately define. Around him the restaurant had fully returned to its rhythm, glasses refilled, plates replaced, quiet laughter rising and falling like background music. And yet his table felt separate, as if the space around him had shifted just enough to isolate the moment. He was used to influence that extended outward, bending rooms, guiding conversations. But this time the movement had gone inward, subtle, controlled, and he was not certain when that had happened. Across the floor, Emily Carter moved between tables with the same steady cadence, her attention precise, her presence consistent. Nothing in her demeanor suggested that anything unusual had taken place. No glance back, no hesitation, no adjustment in behavior. And that absence of acknowledgement lingered more than any confrontation would have. Jonathan finally lifted the check presenter, opening it with a slow, deliberate motion. The number inside clear, expected, exact, no hidden meaning, no alteration, just the cost of the meal, defined and contained. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a pen, not a card. Not yet, the pen resting between his fingers as he stared at the blank line below the total, the place where intention became action. And for a brief moment he did nothing, the kind of stillness that rarely existed in his world, because action was always immediate, decisive, forward. But this pause felt necessary, not strategic, just real. He signed his name slowly, each letter deliberate, controlled, but not rushed, then set the pen down without adding anything else. No note, no extra figure, no extension of the earlier offer, just the signature, complete in its simplicity. He closed the presenter and placed it back where it had been, aligned, centered, as if restoring order to something that had never truly been out of place. Emily approached again, not quickly, not cautiously, just as she always did, her steps measured, her posture unchanged. She picked up the presenter with a quiet efficiency, glancing down only briefly to confirm what she already expected, then lifting her gaze back to him. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice the same as before, professional, steady, without added weight. And Jonathan nodded once, a small gesture, but different from the ones he had given earlier, less performative, more grounded. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if considering whether to say something more, something that would re-establish the structure he understood, but the words did not come, or rather, they did not fit. Not in the way they usually did, and that realization settled quietly, not as frustration, but as acceptance. Emily turned to leave, the interaction complete in her world, the same way it had been at every other table. But just before she moved beyond the edge of his space, Jonathan spoke again, his voice lower now, not carrying, not commanding, just present. "Miss Carter," he said, and she paused, turning back slightly, giving him her attention without shifting her stance. "Yes, sir," she replied, and he looked at her, not searching, not testing, just seeing. "You never answered the game," he said, the words softer than before, almost reflective, and Emily held his gaze for a brief moment, her expression unchanged, but something in her eyes steadier than anything he had encountered that night. "There was no game," she said quietly, and then she turned, continuing on her path without hesitation, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt like a challenge, but something clearer, something simpler. And Jonathan Reeves remained seated for a moment longer, not because he needed to, but because for the first time in a long time, he understood that control was not always about making the next move. Sometimes it was about recognizing when there was no move to make at all. Jonathan Reeves stood up slowly, not with the usual sharp efficiency that marked his movements, but with a measured pause, as if the simple act of leaving required more thought than it should have. He adjusted his jacket, smoothing the fabric across his shoulders, a familiar gesture, controlled, precise, yet it felt different now, not as a signal of dominance, but as a quiet reset. He glanced once more across the dining room, his eyes finding Emily Carter without effort. She was at another table, leaning slightly as she listened to a guest, her expression attentive, calm, unchanged, and for a brief moment, he considered walking over, saying something more, something that would restore the balance he was used to, but the impulse faded just as quickly as it came, because he understood now that anything added would only reduce what had already been said. He turned instead, stepping away from the table. Each step steady, unhurried, the polished floor reflecting the movement of a man who had spent years controlling every outcome. And yet tonight had not been about outcomes. The host near the entrance straightened slightly as Jonathan approached, offering a polite nod. "Good evening, Mr. Reeves," he said. But Jonathan only returned a small acknowledgement, his attention not fully on the exchange, his mind still tracing the quiet space that had formed back at the table. Outside, the night air was cool, a soft breeze moving through the city, carrying distant sounds of traffic and conversation. He paused just beyond the door, his hand resting briefly against the frame, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, the kind that lingers after something shifts in a way that cannot be reversed. He stepped forward onto the sidewalk, the lights from the restaurant casting a warm glow behind him, fading as he moved further away. A black car waited at the curb, engine running, the driver already stepping out to open the door, but Jonathan lifted a hand slightly, stopping him, not abruptly, just enough to signal that the moment could wait. He looked back once, not at the building, not at the name above the door, but at the reflection in the glass, faint now, distant, and for the first time in a long time, he did not measure what he saw in terms of success or control. He simply observed it, quietly, without judgment. Then he exhaled, a slow, steady breath, and got into the car without another word. Inside, the silence was immediate, insulated, familiar, but it did not feel the same. His phone rested in his hand, screen dark, filled with messages that could change markets, redirect decisions, move numbers that defined entire industries. But he did not unlock it. Not yet. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed ahead, the city lights passing in smooth lines through the window. And somewhere between one intersection and the next, he understood something simple, something he had overlooked for years. Not everything valuable could be influenced, not everything meaningful could be negotiated, and the realization did not feel like a loss. It felt like clarity, back inside the restaurant. Emily Carter continued her shift, clearing tables, refilling glasses, her movements as consistent as they had been from the start. One of the other waitresses leaned closer for a moment, her voice low, curious. "Was that him?" she asked, glancing toward the door, and Emily gave a small nod, not making more of it than necessary. "He seemed different tonight," the waitress added, but Emily only offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile, not of victory, not of satisfaction, just acknowledgement. "People are," she said quietly, and then she turned, carrying a tray toward the next table, her pace steady, her presence unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. And in a way, nothing had, because the most significant shifts rarely announced themselves. They simply happened, quietly, in the spaces where no one was trying to win. The city stretched on in quiet lines of light as the car finally slowed in front of a glass tower that rose into the night with silent authority, the kind of building that did not need to announce power, because it already held it in every reflection. Jonathan Reeves stepped out without waiting for the driver this time. The cool air meeting him again, sharper here, cleaner, the hum of the street softer compared to the insulated calm he had left behind. He stood for a moment at the base of the building, looking up not to admire it, but to recognize something familiar, something structured, predictable, something that always responded when he moved. And yet tonight, even that certainty felt slightly altered, not diminished, just no longer absolute. He walked inside, the lobby lights bright, precise, the marble floor echoing his steps in clean, measured beats. The receptionist straightened immediately, offering a professional greeting, but Jonathan only nodded once, his pace uninterrupted. He moved toward the private elevator, the doors opening without delay, responding to his presence as they always had. And as he stepped inside, The reflection returned, clearer now, contained within polished steel, his posture unchanged, his expression composed, yet something behind it quieter than before. The doors closed, sealing him into a space where everything obeyed design. And still, his thoughts drifted elsewhere, not to a deal, not to a number, but to a sentence, simple, unforced. There was no game. It replayed without distortion, without interpretation, just as it had been said. And for the first time, he did not try to analyze it, did not try to extract advantage from it. He simply let it exist. The elevator rose smoothly, each floor passing without sound. And when the doors opened again, he stepped into an office that overlooked the entire city, glass walls stretching from floor to ceiling, lights below forming patterns that could be read like data, like opportunity, like control. His desk remained exactly as he had left it, files aligned, screens ready, everything waiting for instruction. But he did not sit immediately. Instead, he walked to the window, his hands resting lightly against the glass. The city spread beneath him, vast, responsive, and yet distant in a way it had not felt before. His phone vibrated again, more insistent this time. The urgency stacking, building, expecting resolution, and he picked it up, unlocking the screen with a single motion. The messages clear, direct, problems that required answers, decisions that carried weight. And for a moment, he read them all, each one familiar, each one solvable. And then he placed the phone down on the desk, not ignoring it, not dismissing it, just setting it aside long enough to remain where he was, looking out, allowing the silence to hold. Back at the restaurant, the final tables were being cleared, chairs adjusted, the last guests stepping out into the night. Emily Carter wiped down the surface of the same table where Jonathan had sat, her movements steady, precise, the cloth moving in slow, even strokes, removing what had been left behind, not just the physical traces, but the moment itself, returning the space to its original state, neutral. Ready? She aligned the salt and pepper, adjusted the edge of the napkin, details small but intentional. And then she stepped back, observing the table for a brief second, not with pride, not with reflection, just confirmation. It was complete. She turned away without hesitation, moving toward the next task, the next quiet action that required no recognition, no reward. And in the stillness of the now empty room, the only thing left behind was something that could not be seen, a shift that had already moved on, carried not by the place, but by the people who had passed through it. And somewhere high above the city, standing before a window that reflected everything he had built, Jonathan Reeves remained still for just a moment longer, understanding without needing to name it that for the first time, he had not won, and yet he had not lost either. He had simply been met by something that did not measure itself against him at all. The office remained quiet long after the city had settled into its rhythm, the distant lights steady, unwavering. As Jonathan Reeves finally moved away from the glass, his steps slower now, not hesitant, but deliberate in a way that no longer rushed toward the next decision. He reached his desk and rested his hand lightly against its edge, feeling the smooth surface beneath his fingertips, familiar, controlled, a place where outcomes were shaped and measured. And yet tonight, the certainty it usually offered felt incomplete, not lacking, just no longer absolute. He sat down, the chair adjusting automatically, responding to his weight, aligning to his posture, everything functioning exactly as designed. And still, his mind did not return to the messages waiting on his screen. Instead, it circled back to something simpler, something that did not require resolution, the quiet space between words, the absence of reaction that had not challenged him, only existed beside him. And for the first time, he recognized that presence as something stronger than resistance, because it did not depend on him at all. His phone lit up again, the screen bright against the dim room. Numbers, names, decisions waiting, but he did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his gaze lifting toward the ceiling, not searching, not calculating, just allowing the moment to remain unfilled. And in that stillness, something shifted, not in the world outside, but in the way he understood it. The need to direct, to influence, to win, softened into something quieter, something more precise. Not everything required a move. Not everything needed to be answered. Some things simply stood as they were, complete without adjustment. Back at the restaurant, the lights had dimmed, the final tasks completed with quiet efficiency. Chairs lifted, floors cleaned, the last traces of the evening erased without ceremony. Emily Carter tied the strings of her apron loose, the fabric falling back into place as she stepped away from the service station, her movements unhurried, her expression unchanged. One of the staff members passed by, offering a casual goodbye, and she returned it with a small nod. Nothing more, because for her the night had followed its course. Nothing added, nothing taken, just done. She walked toward the door, the same door every shift ended at, the handle cool beneath her hand as she stepped outside into the night. The air calm, the street quieter now. She paused for a brief second, not to reflect, not to revisit anything that had happened, but simply to exist in the stillness before moving on. Then she continued down the sidewalk, her pace steady, her presence the same as it had been all evening, unchanged by what others might have considered significant, because for her, there had been no game, nothing to win, nothing to prove, only a moment that passed like any other, and somewhere high above the city. In a room built for decisions that shaped entire industries, Jonathan Reeves finally reached for his phone, not with urgency, but with clarity, his movements precise, his mind settled in a way that did not rely on control. He began to respond, not faster, not louder, but differently. Each decision grounded, each action measured without the need to dominate. And as the night carried on, two lives moved forward in parallel, one unchanged because it never needed to shift.